January 1st, 1942. A cramped laboratory at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, Malvern College, Worcestershire. Dr. Bernard Lovell stared at the cathode ray tube glowing dimly on the bench before him, watching ghostly images flicker across its circular screen. The decision he was about to make contradicted direct orders from the most powerful scientific authority in Britain. No cavity magnetrons over Germany. The policy was absolute. Lord Cherwell, Winston Churchill's science advisor, had made that crystal clear. Yet Lovell reached for his telephone anyway because he understood something they refused to see. Without airborne radar, British bombers would never find their targets through clouds and darkness. Without airborne radar, crews would die for nothing. Without airborne radar, the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail. He called contacts at bomber squadrons and RAF headquarters. There were no written orders. There would be no paper trail, just quiet conversations between scientists and operational commanders who understood what was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Pathfinder aircraft would be secretly equipped with H-2S radar systems using cavity magnetrons, the technology Churchill's science advisor had forbidden from flying over enemy territory. If anyone in the scientific hierarchy discovered this unauthorized deployment, Lovell would take full responsibility. If his gamble failed and the Germans recovered an intact magnetron, his career was finished. But if the bombing campaign continued failing, thousands more bomber crews would die trying to navigate by dead reckoning to targets they couldn't find. Lovell had no way of knowing that his act of quiet defiance would make possible one of the most devastating air raids in military history. 13 months later, on July 24, 1943, 791 RAF bombers would climb into the night sky carrying forbidden technology. They would navigate through solid cloud cover to Hamburg using radar that showed them the city below. They would mark their targets with precision impossible just months earlier. They would arrive at exact coordinates at the planned time, and they would create a firestorm that killed 42,000 German civilians because Lovell had defied official policy and given them the navigation capability to find their target. The story of how forbidden radar destroyed Hamburg begins not with bombs or incendiaries, but with bureaucratic warfare in the halls of British science. It is a story of physicists who saw the future clearly, while their superiors clung to security concerns. It is a story of engineers who handed Bomber Command a tool so valuable that some argued it was too dangerous to use. And it is ultimately a story of how technology considered too secret to risk changed aerial warfare forever, succeeding through a combination of innovative engineering, scientific courage, and defiance that bordered on insubordination. The mathematics of aerial bombing in 1941 were brutally discouraging. RAF Bomber Command sent thousands of aircraft over Germany in the first 2 years of war, but analysis of reconnaissance photographs revealed catastrophic failure. An independent study conducted by Mr. D.M., butt of the War Cabinet Secretariat, examined over 600 photographs taken during night raids in June and July 1941. His findings destroyed the illusion that bombing was achieving significant results. Only 1/3 of aircraft claiming to have bombed their targets actually came within 5 miles of them. Over the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland and the most heavily defended area, only 1 bomb in 10 hit within 5 miles of the aiming point. Half the bombs dropped on Germany fell in open countryside where they killed nothing except farmers' livestock and cratered empty fields. The Butt Report, as it became known, represented an indictment of the entire strategic bombing campaign. Crews were dying for nothing. Bombers were being lost to flak and fighters at unsustainable rates while achieving minimal damage to German war production. Something had to change, or the bombing campaign would be abandoned as a wasteful failure that consumed men and machines without meaningful impact. The fundamental problem was navigation. Flying at night over blacked-out territory with no visible landmarks, navigators relied on dead reckoning. They calculated compass headings, estimated wind drift, tracked airspeed and time. Errors accumulated over hundreds of miles. A 5-degree navigation error maintained for 300 miles placed the bomber 15 miles from its intended position. When the target itself might be obscured by clouds, when anti-aircraft fire and searchlights forced constant evasive maneuvers. When fighters attacked from darkness, accurate navigation became nearly impossible. Even when bombers reached the approximate area of their targets, identifying specific aiming points through darkness required visual markers. Fires from earlier bombs, rivers reflecting moonlight, distinctive terrain features. But Germany learned quickly to create decoy fires and false targets miles from actual cities. And on cloudy nights, when the ground remained invisible beneath solid overcast, bombing became pure guesswork. Crews dropped their loads based on estimated time over target and hoped for the best. The solution seemed obvious to some. Develop electronic navigation aids that would guide bombers to their targets regardless of weather or visibility. The British had already created two such systems, G and oboe. G used synchronized pulses from multiple transmitters in England. Aircraft equipped with G receivers could determine their position by measuring the time difference between pulses. The system worked brilliantly for targets within about 350 miles of the British coast, providing accuracy to within a few miles. Oboe was even more precise, using two ground stations to guide aircraft along a precise track to the target. One station transmitted a signal that kept the bomber on course. The other measured its distance and transmitted a signal when the bomber reached the release point. Mosquito aircraft flying at 30,000 feet and equipped with oboe could place markers within yards of the aiming point. But both systems had fundamental limitations. They were ground-based, dependent on line-of-sight transmissions from England. As bombers flew deeper into Germany, beyond the 350-mile range of the transmitters, the signals became unusable. Berlin lay beyond G range. Industrial cities in central and eastern Germany remained inaccessible to navigation aids, and both systems could handle only limited numbers of aircraft simultaneously. Oboe could guide perhaps one aircraft every 10 minutes, inadequate for the massive bomber streams that Bomber Command was planning to send over Germany. What bombers needed was self-contained navigation equipment that worked at any range, that required no ground stations, that allowed each aircraft to navigate independently. They needed airborne radar that could map the terrain below and display it in a form that navigators could interpret. The technology existed. British scientists had been experimenting with airborne radar since the beginning of the war, but making it work required a breakthrough in power output and wavelength. Early radar systems operated at wavelengths of 1.5 meters, far too long to provide useful resolution for terrain mapping. The antennas required for such wavelengths were enormous, impractical for aircraft installation, and the transmitters produced relatively weak signals that provided poor returns from ground features. Everything changed with the cavity magnetron. This device, developed at the University of Birmingham by John Randall and Harry Boot in February 1940, generated microwave radiation at wavelengths measured in centimeters rather than meters. The prototype magnetron produced 400 watts at 9.8 centimeters wavelength. Later versions would produce kilowatts of power. The cavity magnetron was revolutionary for multiple reasons. Its compact size, just a few inches across, meant it could fit in aircraft without consuming excessive space or weight. Its power output exceeded anything previously achieved at microwave frequencies by factors of hundreds or thousands, and its short wavelength meant that relatively small antennas could focus the beam tightly, providing resolution measured in degrees rather than the broad patterns of earlier radar. The device itself was ingeniously simple in concept, though devilishly difficult to manufacture properly. A solid copper block contained multiple resonant cavities arranged in a circle. An electron beam, bent into a circular path by a powerful magnet, passed each cavity in sequence. The electrons interacted with the electromagnetic fields in the cavities, giving up energy that built into powerful microwave oscillations. The result was a compact, efficient generator of precisely tuned microwave radiation. British scientists understood immediately that this device could transform radar, airborne interception radar for night fighters, previously requiring massive antennas and providing poor performance, could now fit in the nose of single-engine fighters and detect enemy bombers at useful ranges. Anti-submarine radar for coastal command aircraft could spot submarine conning towers on the surface at night, and terrain mapping radar for bombers could navigate to targets hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. In August 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged overhead, Sir Henry Tizard led a small delegation of British scientists across the Atlantic, carrying Britain's most valuable technical secrets. The delegation included physicist Edward George Bowen, who carried cavity magnetron serial, number 12, in a small metal box. This magnetron, one of the prototype units built by General Electric Company at Wembley, represented Britain's most important technological breakthrough. The Tizard mission, as it became known, aimed to share British radar technology with the United States in exchange for American industrial capacity to manufacture the devices in quantity. Britain, under nightly attack by the Luftwaffe and struggling to maintain essential war production, could not exploit the magnetron's potential without American help. On September 19, 1940, Bowen demonstrated the cavity magnetron to American scientists at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. The Americans were astonished. Their best microwave generators, using klystron tubes, produced at most 10 watts of power. The British magnetron produced kilowatts. The power difference was so enormous that some Americans initially suspected fraud or measurement error. But when General Electric engineers tested the device, they confirmed its performance. This single component represented a quantum leap in radar technology. Within weeks, Bell Telephone Laboratories received contracts to produce copies of the British magnetron. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology established the Radiation Laboratory, soon employing thousands of scientists and engineers developing radar applications. By the end of 1940, American industry was tooling up to manufacture magnetrons in quantity. By the end of the war, over 1 million cavity magnetrons had been produced, equipping everything from bomber navigation radars to proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. But in Britain, where the magnetron had been invented, bureaucratic caution threatened to prevent its deployment in the most critical application. Lord Cherwell, Churchill's science advisor and a powerful figure in British science policy, adamantly opposed putting magnetrons in bombers. His reasoning was logical. Every bomber sent over Germany faced substantial risk of being shot down. If a bomber carrying a magnetron crashed in territory the Germans could reach, they would recover the device. German scientists would analyze it, learn its operating principles, and develop their own versions. The Germans would then build their own microwave radars, potentially closing the technology gap that currently favored Britain. German night fighters equipped with compact, powerful radar could decimate British bomber streams. German anti-aircraft batteries, guided by accurate radar, could shoot down bombers with devastating efficiency. The risk, Cherwell argued, was unacceptable. Britain's technology advantage must be preserved at all costs. Magnetrons would not fly over enemy territory. The prohibition had support from some military commanders as well. If magnetrons were limited to maritime patrol aircraft operating over water, any aircraft shot down would sink, carrying its secrets to the ocean bottom where the Germans could never recover them. Coastal Command could use magnetron-equipped ASV radar to hunt U-boats with devastating effectiveness. But Bomber Command would have to continue navigating by dead reckoning and accepting terrible bombing accuracy. Bernard Lovell understood that this decision condemned thousands of bomber crews to death. Born August 31, 1913 in Oldland Common, Bristol. Lovell studied physics at the University of Bristol, earning his Bachelor of Science degree in 1934 and his doctorate in 1936. His doctoral research focused on the electrical conductivity of thin metallic films, work that gave him deep understanding of electromagnetic phenomena and experimental technique. When war came, Lovell joined the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the centre of British radar development. TRE had been formed from earlier radar research groups and concentrated Britain's best scientists and engineers in one organisation dedicated to developing radar applications for all three military services. The establishment had been located initially at Swanage on the south coast, but after intelligence suggested the Germans might attempt a commando raid to capture radar equipment, TRE moved to Malvern College in Worcestershire in May 1942. Lovell arrived at TRE with expertise in physics and a talent for solving complex technical problems. He was assigned to work on airborne radar development, specifically systems for bombers. In early 1941, TRE scientists conducted experiments with an early aircraft interception radar operating at 9.1 centimeters wavelength using a cavity magnetron. During test flights, operators noticed something unexpected. The radar, designed to detect aircraft, was receiving strong returns from the ground. Different types of terrain produced distinctly different signatures on the display. Water bodies produced weak returns, appearing dark on the screen. Open countryside produced moderate returns. Built-up areas, cities and towns produced strong returns that appeared bright. The contrast was dramatic enough that operators could identify coastlines, rivers, and urban areas with remarkable clarity. Someone realized this accidental discovery could solve Bomber Command's navigation problem. If the system could be adapted specifically for terrain mapping, if the display could be optimized to show ground features clearly, bombers could navigate over Germany with unprecedented accuracy. They could identify cities from dozens of miles away. They could follow rivers to specific targets. They could find their way through clouds and darkness using nothing but the radar returns from the terrain below. In January 1942, TRE established a new team under Lovell's leadership to develop what would become known as H2S radar. The designation's origin remains somewhat mysterious. Official explanations claimed it stood for Home Sweet Home, suggesting its function helping bombers navigate home. Other accounts suggested it meant height to slope, referring to its ability to map terrain. The most plausible explanation is that Lord Cherwell, upon being briefed on the project, declared the idea of using magnetrons in bombers over Germany to be H2S, using the chemical formula for hydrogen sulfide, a gas famous for its foul smell. The name stuck as deliberate irony. The H2S team faced enormous technical challenges. The system had to scan the terrain below the aircraft in a complete 360-degree circle. It had to process the returns and display them on a cathode ray tube in a form navigators could interpret. It had to be compact enough to fit in bombers without consuming excessive space. It had to be reliable enough to operate for hours at a time in the harsh environment of high-altitude flight. And it had to be developed and manufactured in quantity within months, not years. The scanner design was particularly challenging. A rotating antenna beneath the aircraft had to spin continuously, transmitting pulses and receiving echoes from all directions. The antenna had to focus the beam tightly enough to provide useful resolution but cover a wide area around the aircraft. Engineers designed a parabolic dish approximately 3 feet in diameter, mounted in a streamlined housing that protruded from the bomber's belly. The dish rotated at high speed, driven by a motor, sweeping the beam in a continuous circle. The display, called a Plan Position Indicator, or PPI, showed the terrain as if viewed from above. The aircraft's position appeared at the center of the circular screen. Returns from the ground appeared as bright spots, with brightness proportional to signal strength. As the scanner rotated, the display built up a complete map of the terrain surrounding the aircraft. Water appeared dark, cities appeared bright. The navigator could identify major landmarks and navigate using them. The electronics required to make all this work represented the cutting edge of radar technology. The magnetron had to generate precise, powerful pulses. The receiver had to detect extremely weak echoes and amplify them without adding excessive noise. The display had to convert the timing of echoes into position on the screen with accuracy sufficient for useful navigation. Every component had to work reliably in conditions of vibration, temperature variation, and electrical interference that would destroy most civilian electronic equipment. Lovell's team worked with desperate intensity. They understood what was at stake. Every month of delay meant thousands more bomber crew members would die trying to navigate by dead reckoning. Every technical problem they couldn't solve meant the system would fail in operational use. The pressure was relentless. Test flights revealed problems. The display was difficult to interpret. Returns from ground clutter sometimes masked the features navigators needed to see. The system was sensitive to altitude, with optimal performance at specific heights that might not match operational requirements. By mid-1942, The team had overcome most technical obstacles. Test flights demonstrated that H-2S could identify cities at ranges exceeding 50 miles, coastal targets like Hamburg, where the Elbe River provided unmistakable contrast between water and land, appeared on the display with extraordinary clarity. Berlin, with its multiple lakes and rivers, would be clearly identifiable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Industrial cities in the Ruhr would show as bright clusters against darker countryside, but Lord Cherwell's prohibition remained in force. No magnetrons over Germany. The scientists at TRE grew increasingly frustrated. They had developed a system that could transform Bomber Command's effectiveness. They had solved the technical challenges. They had equipment ready to install in operational bombers, and bureaucratic caution prevented them from using it where it was most needed. Then, disaster struck. On June 7, 1942, a Halifax bomber conducting H-2S test flights crashed, killing everyone aboard. Among the dead was Alan Blumlein, one of Britain's most brilliant electronics engineers. Blumlein, working for EMI but attached to the H-2S development team, had designed critical components of the system, including the line-type pulse modulator that generated the high-voltage pulses driving the magnetron. His death was a devastating blow to the program. The crash investigation revealed metal fatigue in the tail assembly, a design flaw unrelated to the H-2S equipment. But the loss of Blumlein's expertise and the psychological impact of losing colleagues in such a preventable accident demoralized the entire team. Development stalled for weeks. Some questioned whether H-2S would ever become operational. Churchill's science advisor saw the crash as confirmation of his concerns. If test flights were this dangerous, operational flights over Germany would inevitably result in losses, and when bombers carrying H-2S were shot down over Germany, the magnetrons would fall into enemy hands. The prohibition must remain in force. Better to accept lower bombing accuracy than to hand the Germans microwave radar technology. But Bomber Command needed H-2S desperately. The bomber offensive against Germany was failing. Losses were increasing while bombing accuracy remained abysmal. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who took command of Bomber Command in February 1942, was building a force capable of launching 1,000 bomber raids. But even 1,000 bombers couldn't destroy their targets if they couldn't find them. Harris understood that electronic navigation aids were essential to his strategy. He had already embraced GI and oboe despite their limitations. He supported H-2S development enthusiastically. He recognized that accepting some risk of technology compromise was preferable to continuing the current futile bombing campaign. Lives would be saved overall, even if some magnetrons fell into German hands. Lovell faced an impossible choice: continue following Cherwell's orders and watch bomber crews die for lack of effective navigation, or quietly enable H-2S deployment and accept personal responsibility if the decision proved disastrous. He chose defiance. Not open rebellion, which would have been crushed immediately, but careful, quiet circumvention of the prohibition. The decision to defy Lord Cherwell came not through a single dramatic moment but through a series of conversations, meetings, and carefully worded memoranda that gradually shifted policy without explicitly challenging it. Lovell worked through intermediaries. He briefed Bomber Command officers on H-2S capabilities, demonstrating what the system could do, building support among the operational commanders who understood how desperately it was needed. He coordinated with other TRE scientists who shared his conviction that magnetrons had to fly over Germany if the bombing campaign was to succeed. They drafted technical papers emphasizing H-2S's potential to reduce bomber losses by improving navigation accuracy, framing the technology compromise risk as acceptable compared to the certainty of continued high casualties from poor navigation. Robert Renwick, who served as liaison between TRE and the government, proved crucial. Renwick had Churchill's ear and understood both the technical realities and the political constraints. He advocated quietly but persistently for H-2S deployment, arguing that the Germans would inevitably develop microwave radar on their own, that Britain's lead was temporary, regardless of whether magnetrons fell into German hands, that delaying H-2S deployment cost British lives without providing lasting security benefits. In autumn 1942, the policy quietly changed. No formal announcement, no reversal of Cherwell's prohibition, just a gradual shift from absolute prohibition to cautious, limited deployment. H-2S would be installed in bombers, but only in aircraft assigned to the Pathfinder Force, the elite squadrons responsible for marking targets for the main bomber force. If a Pathfinder was shot down, it would presumably crash in or near the target city, where fires and destruction might consume the wreckage before the Germans could recover intact magnetrons. This compromise satisfied no one completely but provided a path forward. Lovell had not openly defied Cherwell. He had simply worked through channels, building support among those who understood the operational necessity until the prohibition eroded from within. It was bureaucratic warfare of the subtlest kind, the kind that leaves no paper trail of insubordination but changes policy through accumulated pressure. Production began on H-2S Mark I equipment. The first units, essentially hand-built prototypes, went to newly formed Pathfinder squadrons in December 1942. Installation proved time-consuming. Ground crews had to cut openings in bomber fuselages for the scanner housings. Electrical systems had to be modified to supply power to the H-2S equipment. Crews had to be trained to operate and maintain the complex electronics. The first operational use of H-2S came on January 30, 1943. A force of bombers attacked Hamburg, with Pathfinders using H-2S to mark the target despite thick cloud cover that made visual identification impossible. The raid demonstrated H-2S's potential. Pathfinders placed markers much closer to the intended aiming point than dead reckoning navigation would have allowed. Bombing accuracy improved noticeably, but losses remained high, and only a handful of bombers carried H-2S. Then came the loss that Cherwell had feared. On the night of February 2-3, 1943, during only the second operational mission using H-2S, one of the short Stirling bombers carrying the system was shot down near Rotterdam by a German night fighter. The aircraft crashed, but the H-2S equipment survived largely intact. German recovery teams reached the wreckage before British commandos could destroy it. The magnetron, that precious device Britain had guarded so carefully, fell into German hands. German scientists examined it with astonishment. They had been working on magnetron development themselves, but had achieved nothing approaching the British device's power output or compact design. The captured magnetron revealed engineering details, manufacturing techniques, and design principles that would have taken years to develop independently. Within days, the recovered equipment, designated Rotterdam Gerrit after the city where it was found, reached Telefunken laboratories in Berlin. German scientists immediately began reverse engineering both the magnetron and the complete H-2S system. They photographed every component, measured every dimension, tested every circuit. By February 22nd, less than 3 weeks after the crash, the first meeting convened to discuss German responses to this technology. The Germans faced a choice. Should they attempt to copy the British system, building their own microwave radars for offensive use, or should they focus on developing countermeasures, devices that could detect H-2S transmissions and allow German night fighters to home in on bombers using the system? Logic dictated the latter approach. Germany's strategic situation in early 1943 differed fundamentally from Britain's. Britain needed to bomb Germany. Germany needed to defend against those bombers. A radar warning receiver that could detect H-2S transmissions would be simpler to develop than a complete radar system, and it would serve German needs better. If night fighters could detect bombers from long range by listening for their H-2S transmissions, the British technology advantage would transform into a fatal vulnerability. Telefunken engineers began designing what would become the Fug 350 Naxos radar detector. The system would use a simple crystal receiver, far less complex than a complete radar, to detect the microwave energy radiated by H-2S sets. A rotating antenna on top of the night fighter would scan continuously, indicating the direction of any H2S transmission. The operator would see a bright spot on a circular display, showing the bearing to the transmitting bomber. But development proceeded slowly. German industry had abandoned microwave research earlier in the war, deciding that the technology was too immature to contribute to the war effort before conflict ended. This decision now proved catastrophic. The engineers and manufacturing facilities that could have developed Naxos quickly had been redirected to other projects. Critical components, particularly suitable crystal detectors for microwave frequencies, were scarce. Naxos would eventually enter service in September 1943, 7 months after the Rotterdam crash, but production remained limited. Only dozens of units existed by late 1944, far too few to equip the German night fighter force comprehensively. The devices that were produced proved difficult to operate and maintain. The crystal detectors failed regularly, the rotating antennas jammed, and the displays provided bearing information but no range, making it difficult to close with specific bombers in the crowded airspace of a bomber stream. The transformation of Bomber Command's effectiveness became apparent in July 1943 during Operation Gomorrah, the series of raids that destroyed Hamburg. Air Chief Marshal Harris had been planning a maximum effort against Germany's second-largest city, a major port and industrial centre with critical shipbuilding yards, U-boat pens, and oil refineries. Hamburg's location near the coast, on the prominent Elbe River, made it an ideal target for H-2S-equipped bombers. Harris planned to combine several innovations in a devastating attack. H-2S radar would guide pathfinders to mark targets accurately even through cloud cover. A new countermeasure called Window would blind German radar, and concentrated incendiary bombing would create firestorms that would consume entire sections of the city. The plan was ruthless, thorough, and designed to demonstrate what Bomber Command could achieve when all its capabilities came together. Operation Gomorrah began on the night of July 24–25, 1943. 791 bombers took off from bases across England, forming into a bomber stream that stretched across the night sky. They carried a mixture of high-explosive and incendiary bombs calculated to create maximum destruction. Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with H-2S, led the force. Their task was to mark the aiming point with target indicators that the main force would bomb on. The Pathfinders used H-2S to navigate directly to Hamburg, despite 10/10 cloud cover that made visual identification impossible. The H-2S displays showed Hamburg's distinctive signature clearly. The Elbe River appeared as a dark line snaking through the city. Docks and industrial areas along the river produced strong returns. The city centre appeared as a bright concentration of echoes. At 57 minutes past midnight on July 25th, the first Pathfinders arrived over Hamburg and began dropping yellow target indicators. The parachute flares ignited, marking the aiming point with lights visible through gaps in the clouds. More Pathfinders followed, dropping red and green target indicators, creating a cluster of markers that defined the target area. The main force bombed on these markers, dropping 2,396 tons of bombs in 50 minutes. The climactic raid came on the night of July 27th, 28th. 722 RAF bombers returned to Hamburg, guided again by H-2S-equipped Pathfinders. The Pathfinders marked an aiming point approximately 2 miles east of the city centre, in a densely populated residential area. The main force delivered 2,313 tons of bombs, approximately 2/3 of them incendiaries, into an area measuring roughly 2 miles by 1 mile. The concentration of bombing in such a small area, combined with unusually dry weather and high temperatures, created conditions for disaster. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires merged into a single conflagration. The heat generated powerful convection currents that pulled in air from surrounding areas, creating winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. Temperatures in the fire zone reached 800 degrees Celsius or higher. Everything combustible burst into flame. The firestorm lasted approximately 3 hours. It consumed 8 square miles of Hamburg completely. Estimates of casualties vary, but most historians accept approximately 42,000 deaths during Operation Gomorrah, with at least half occurring during the firestorm on July 27–28. Another 37,000 people were injured. Over 214,000 dwellings were destroyed out of 414,000 in the city. Approximately 1.2 million people, about two-thirds of Hamburg's population, fled the city. The destruction shocked Germany. Hamburg was not a frontline city, but a major urban centre deep in German territory. If the British could devastate Hamburg so completely, no German city was safe. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, told Hitler that 6 more raids like Hamburg against different cities would end the war. German civil defence and anti-aircraft systems had proven inadequate. The combination of H-2S navigation, concentrated bombing, and the new window radar countermeasure had rendered German defences nearly useless. But Harris did not launch 6 more Hamburg-level raids. The destruction of Hamburg represented the convergence of multiple factors that proved difficult to replicate. H-2S worked best over coastal cities, where water provided sharp contrast on the displays. Inland cities like Berlin appeared less distinctly. Weather conditions that contributed to the Hamburg firestorm occurred rarely, and German defences adapted rapidly to the new threats. The Germans never fully recovered from losing Hamburg, but they prevented similar disasters through improved civil defence, better firefighting coordination, and gradual adaptation to British tactics. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, but Hamburg demonstrated conclusively that H-2S guided bombing could achieve results impossible with earlier navigation methods. The forbidden radar had proven its worth in the most devastating way imaginable. Thousands of German civilians died because Bernard Lovell and others had quietly enabled deployment of magnetrons over Germany despite Cherwell's prohibition. Whether that decision was morally justified remains debated, but its military effectiveness was undeniable. H-2S would continue in service for decades. Mark III versions operating at 3 cm wavelength, providing even better resolution, entered service in late 1943. The American version, H-2X, used the same principles but incorporated improvements in display quality and electronics reliability. Both systems guided bombers throughout the remainder of the war, not only in Europe but in the Pacific, where B-29 superfortresses used AN divided by APQ-13 radar, derived from H-2X, to bomb Japan through clouds and darkness. The technology that Churchill's science advisor had forbidden, that Lovell had quietly enabled despite official policy, transformed aerial warfare. It made strategic bombing effective. It saved thousands of bomber crew lives by improving navigation accuracy and reducing the need for repeated attacks on the same targets. And it demonstrated that sometimes the right decision requires defying authority when rules made in safety conflict with reality at the first. Sharp end of war. Bernard Lovell received an OBE in 1946 for his radar work during the war. After the conflict ended, he attempted to continue his studies of cosmic rays using ex-military radar equipment, but he suffered much background interference from electric trams on Manchester's Oxford Road. He moved his equipment to a more remote location, establishing what would become Jodrell Bank Observatory near Goostry in Cheshire. With university funding, he constructed the then largest steerable radio telescope in the world, which now bears his name, the Lovell Telescope. Over 50 years after its construction, it remains a productive radio telescope. Lovell was knighted in 1961 for his important contributions to radio astronomy. He lived until August 6, 2012, dying at his home in Swettenham, Cheshire, at age 98. His H-2S radar work remained somewhat overshadowed by his astronomy achievements in public consciousness. The general public knows Jodrell Bank and the Lovell Telescope. Fewer people know that Lovell led development of the radar system that enabled the destruction of Hamburg. This reflects broader patterns in how technical achievements are remembered. Scientists who make peacetime contributions receive public recognition. Wartime work, especially when controversial, often remains less celebrated even when its impact was profound. The moral questions about Hamburg and strategic bombing more broadly remain unresolved decades later. 42,000 civilians died in the firestorm, most of them women, children, and elderly people who had no direct involvement in Germany's war effort. Was this justified by military necessity? Would the war have lasted longer without strategic bombing of German cities? Did destroying urban areas and killing civilians save Allied lives by shortening the conflict? These questions have no simple answers, and historians continue debating them. What is clear from a technical standpoint is that H2S made strategic bombing effective in ways it had not been before. Whether strategic bombing itself was justified militarily, morally, or strategically is a separate question. The technology worked as designed, enabling bombers to find and destroy targets through conditions that would have made such operations impossible earlier. Whether it should have been used that way remains contested. The lesson of the H2S story extends beyond the specific circumstances of World War II bombing campaigns. Military organizations in every era must balance the need for security against operational necessity. Regulations protecting classified technology serve important purposes, preventing adversaries from acquiring capabilities that could be used against friendly forces. But regulations that prevent deployment of desperately needed capabilities can cost more lives than the security risks they attempt to mitigate. Finding the right balance requires judgment that cannot be reduced to simple rules. Sometimes the right answer is accepting calculated risk to gain operational advantage. Cherwell's caution about magnetron security was reasonable, given what was known in 1942. His absolute prohibition against deployment proved wrong because it failed to account for how desperately the technology was needed and how ineffective the bombing campaign was without it. Lovell understood this in ways that Cherwell, working in London offices distant from operational realities, did not. Lovell saw the statistics on bombing accuracy. He understood what navigation by dead reckoning was costing in British lives. He recognized that the security risk Cherwell feared was less important than the operational necessity Bomber Command faced. His defiance of the prohibition created capabilities that changed the bombing campaign's effectiveness fundamentally. The story connects to parallel developments in other aspects of the war. At the same time, Lovell was quietly enabling H2S deployment. Despite Cherwell's prohibition, Benjamin Kelsey in the United States was defying the bomber mafia to give P-38 Lightning fighters drop tank capability they needed for long-range missions. Both acts of bureaucratic defiance proved decisive. Both created capabilities military planners said were impossible or too risky to attempt. Kelsey's unauthorized drop tanks enabled Operation Vengeance, the mission that killed Admiral Yamamoto by allowing P-38 seconds to fly 1,000 miles to intercept him. Lovell's unauthorized radar deployment enabled Operation Gomorrah and subsequent bombing campaigns by allowing bombers to navigate accurately to distant targets through weather that would have prevented operations before. Different technologies, different theaters, different applications. But the same fundamental principle. Sometimes, regulations preventing innovation are more dangerous than the risks innovation creates. Sometimes the officers and scientists closest to operational problems understand necessity better than distant authorities making policy. The ironies surrounding H2S and the Hamburg raids are profound and worth examining. Churchill's science advisor feared that deploying magnetrons over Germany would give the Germans microwave radar technology they could use against Britain. The Germans did recover a magnetron in February 1943. They did analyze it thoroughly. They did understand its principles, but they couldn't exploit it effectively before the war ended. German microwave radar development proceeded slowly, despite having the British magnetron as a template. The Fug 240 Berlin radar, developed from the captured H2S system, saw extremely limited deployment. The Naxos detector that was supposed to allow night fighters to home on H2S transmissions arrived too late and performed poorly. German industry, already stretched beyond capacity, couldn't manufacture microwave components in quantity while also producing conventional radars, fighters, flak guns, and everything else needed for defense. Meanwhile, restricting H2S deployment to protect magnetron security cost British lives every month. The technology remained unused. Every raid that failed to find its target because of poor navigation meant bombers lost, crews killed, and missions wasted, achieving nothing. The security concern, though logical in theory, proved less important in practice than the operational necessity that drove Lovell's defiance. Another irony is that the cavity magnetron, Britain's most carefully guarded radar secret, had been shared freely with the United States through the TIZAD mission in September 1940. American industry produced magnetrons in vast quantities, incorporating them into countless radar systems. The technology was already widespread among allies by the time Cherwell was still prohibiting its use over Germany. The prohibition attempted to protect a secret that was no longer exclusively British. Lord Cherwell never apologized for the prohibition or acknowledged that the operational commanders who pushed for H2S deployment had been correct. The policy was quietly abandoned without official recognition that circumstances had proven the caution excessive. But the results demonstrated clearly what was right. H2S guided bombing worked. Crews could find targets through weather that would have prevented operations before. Accuracy improved dramatically. The strategic bombing campaign became effective in ways it had not been during the years of navigation by dead reckoning. The broader impact of H2S extended far beyond the Hamburg raids. Throughout 1943 and 1944, H2S-equipped bombers struck targets across Germany with accuracy impossible earlier. The system guided raids on Berlin during the Battle of Berlin from November 1943 through March 1944. Though Berlin's resolution on H2S displays was poorer than Hamburg's due to the city being inland, the radar still provided navigation capability far superior to dead reckoning. H2S contributed significantly to preparation for D-Day by allowing precise mapping of the French coastline and identification of suitable landing beaches. After the invasion, H2S guided tactical bombing in support of ground forces advancing across France. The system enabled attacks on transportation networks, supply depots, and concentrations of German forces, even when weather prevented visual bombing. In the final months of the war, H2S equipped bombers attacking targets in eastern Germany and supporting the Soviet advance from the east. The system proved invaluable for navigation over unfamiliar territory, where crews had no previous experience and where ground-based navigation aids from Britain could not reach. The Pacific Theatre saw parallel development of American radar systems derived from British H2S technology. The H2X radar, developed at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, used the same principles as H2S, but operated at 3 cm wavelength for improved resolution. American B-17 and B-24 bombers operating over Europe used H2X for bombing through overcast when visual attacks were impossible. In the Pacific, B-29 Superfortress bombers used the AN divided by APQ-13 radar, an advanced derivative of H2X. This system enabled high-altitude area bombing of Japan through cloud cover that would have prevented visual attacks. The AN divided by APQ-13 allowed bombing of Japanese cities with consistency regardless of weather, contributing to the devastation of Japan's urban areas in 1945. The post-war legacy of H2S extended well beyond the immediate conflict. The system remained in service with the Royal Air Force for decades. Advanced versions equipped the V-bomber force during the Cold War. The H2S Mark IX, introduced in the 1950s, formed part of the navigation and bombing system installed in Vickers Valiant, Avro Vulcan, and Handley Page Victor bombers carrying Britain's nuclear deterrent. The Vulcan bombers that attacked Port Stanley Airfield during the Falklands War in 1982 used H2S radar for navigation across thousands of miles of South Atlantic Ocean. The system, developed 40 years earlier, still provided useful capability. Some H2S Mark IX units remained in service on Victor tankers until 1993, giving the technology 50 years of operational use from first deployment to final retirement. The technical principles pioneered by H2S influenced all subsequent airborne ground mapping radars. Modern fighter aircraft and bombers use synthetic aperture radar systems that produce far higher resolution images than H2S ever could. But the basic concept of using microwave radar to map terrain and navigate to targets remains unchanged. The innovation was not superseded, but rather refined and improved through generations of development. The cavity magnetron itself found countless applications beyond military radar. After the war, Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon, noticed that a magnetron had melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. This observation led to development of the microwave oven, applying the same technology that had guided bombers to Hamburg to heating food in homes around the world. The device that Cherwell feared giving to the Germans became a ubiquitous kitchen appliance. The broader lesson about innovation and bureaucracy that emerges from the H2S story applies to military organizations in every era. Militaries need structure, discipline, and procedures. Regulations serve important purposes. Chain of command exists for good reasons. But excessive rigidity, rules that prevent adaptation to changing circumstances, regulations that forbid necessary innovation can be as dangerous as chaos. Finding the balance between necessary discipline and flexibility to innovate is one of the eternal challenges of military leadership. Organizations that enforce regulations too strictly become obsolete, unable to adapt to new threats or exploit new opportunities. Organizations that allow too much deviation lose coherence and become ineffective. The right balance lies somewhere between these extremes and changes depending on circumstances. In 1942, the right balance involved deploying H2S, despite security concerns, because the operational necessity was overwhelming and the security risk, while real, was less catastrophic than the continued failure of the bombing campaign. Lovell understood this. Cherwell, working from different information and priorities, did not. The defiance succeeded because it was right for the circumstances, not because defiance is always appropriate. The human dimension of the story deserves recognition alongside the technical achievement. Lovell was not a military officer, but a civilian scientist working under contract to the military. He had no obligation to risk his career for operational effectiveness. He could have followed Cherwell's orders, continued laboratory development, and avoided all risk of punishment. He chose instead to enable deployment because he understood lives depended on it. The bomber crews who benefited from H2S navigation never knew who had made the decision to deploy the technology despite official prohibition. They knew the system worked, that it helped them find targets, that it improved their chances of completing missions successfully. They didn't know about the bureaucratic battles, the defiance of authority, the personal risks taken by scientists and engineers to give them tools they needed. This reflects a broader pattern in how military effectiveness is really created. The combatants who fight battles become famous. The commanders who make strategic decisions are remembered. But the engineers, scientists, and support personnel who provide the tools that make victory possible often remain anonymous. Their contributions are less visible, harder to quantify, easier to overlook. But without them, military forces cannot function at all. The H2S story also illuminates the relationship between intelligence and technology in modern warfare. At the same time, Lovell was developing radar to guide bombers to Hamburg. American cryptanalysts were breaking Japanese naval codes to enable ambush at Midway. Both achievements involved taking calculated risks. Both succeeded through combination of technical excellence and human courage. Both changed the course of the war in their respective theaters. The codebreakers at Station Hypo risked American intelligence advantage by exploiting knowledge of Yamamoto's itinerary for Operation Vengeance. If Japan realized their codes were broken, they would change cipher systems and America would lose priceless intelligence capability. But the opportunity to kill Japan's greatest admiral was judged worth the risk. The gamble succeeded because Japan never fully realized their communications were compromised. Similarly, Lovell risked British technology advantage by deploying magnetrons over Germany. If the technology fell into German hands intact, they might develop countermeasures or their own microwave radars. But the opportunity to make strategic bombing effective was judged worth the risk. The gamble succeeded because the Germans couldn't exploit the captured magnetron quickly enough to affect the war's outcome significantly. Both gambles could have failed catastrophically. Both succeeded. Both demonstrated that perfect security is sometimes less important than operational effectiveness. The lesson is not that security doesn't matter, but rather that security must be balanced against necessity, and that the balance shifts depending on circumstances. The strategic bombing campaign that H2S enabled remains one of the most controversial aspects of World War II. Historians continue debating whether area bombing of German cities was justified militarily, whether it shortened the war, whether the civilian casualties were proportionate to military gains achieved. These questions have no simple answers, and reasonable people can disagree. What is indisputable is that H2S made the bombing campaign technically feasible in ways it had not been before. Before H2S, most bombs fell in open countryside, miles from targets. After H2S, bombers could navigate accurately to cities and mark specific districts for attack. Whether this capability should have been used for area bombing of cities is a moral question separate from the technical achievement of making it possible. The statistics tell part of the story. During the first 2 years of war, RAF Bomber Command achieved minimal results despite considerable effort and casualties. After H2S deployment in 1943, bombing accuracy improved dramatically. More bombs hit intended targets. Fewer missions were completely wasted. The ratio of results achieved to resources expended shifted favorably. From a military efficiency standpoint, H2S justified its development and deployment. From a moral standpoint, the question of whether strategic bombing itself was justified remains contentious. The technology worked as intended. Whether it was used appropriately is a different matter requiring examination of strategy, ethics, and alternatives available at the time. The men who made H2S possible came from diverse backgrounds and played different roles. John Randall and Harry Boot invented the cavity magnetron at Birmingham University, creating the device that made everything else possible. Henry Tizard led the mission that shared the magnetron with America, enabling mass production. Bernard Lovell led the team that developed H2S radar, solving countless technical problems to create a working system. Robert Renwick provided the political liaison that gradually eroded Cherwell's prohibition. Arthur Harris commanded Bomber Command and pushed for H2S deployment despite security concerns. Countless engineers, technicians, and factory workers built the equipment. Ground crews installed it in bombers. Pathfinder crews learned to operate it under combat conditions. Each contribution was necessary. Each required different skills and courage. The scientists needed technical brilliance and willingness to defy authority. The commanders needed judgment to balance security against operational necessity. The crews needed skill to use the equipment effectively. The industrial workers needed precision to manufacture complex electronics in quantity. Success required all these elements coming together at the right time. 80 years later, military forces still depend on people like Bernard Lovell. They need scientists and engineers who understand technology well enough to recognize when regulations prevent necessary innovation. They need officers who can balance security against operational effectiveness. They need industrial capacity to turn concepts into hardware quickly. They need institutional structures, flexible enough to accommodate innovation while maintaining discipline. The balance remains as delicate now as it was in 1942. Organizations that allow too much deviation lose coherence. Organizations that enforce regulations too rigidly become obsolete. Finding the right balance is one of the fundamental challenges of military leadership in any era. Lovell and the others involved in H2S deployment found that balance in wartime circumstances that demanded it. The forbidden radar that destroyed Hamburg stands as testament to several enduring principles. Innovation requires people willing to challenge established doctrine when lives depend on it. Lovell could have followed orders and avoided all risk to his career. He chose defiance because he understood the necessity. That decision created capabilities that changed the bombing campaign fundamentally. Innovation requires organizational structures that protect innovators from excessive bureaucratic retaliation. Renwick and others provided political cover that allowed H2S deployment to proceed despite official prohibition. Without this protection, the technology would have remained unused regardless of operational need. Innovation requires skilled engineers who can turn concepts into working hardware. The TRE team solved countless technical problems to make H2S function reliably under combat conditions. Excellence in execution was as important as brilliance in conception. Innovation requires operational commanders willing to use new capabilities despite risks. Harris pushed for H2S deployment, understanding it might compromise magnetron security. He judged operational effectiveness more important than perfect security. His judgment proved correct. Technology creates possibilities, but people must choose to exploit those possibilities. The cavity magnetron existed. H2S radar could be built, but deploying it required human decisions at multiple levels, scientists choosing to develop it, engineers choosing to build it, commanders choosing to use it. Each choice involved risk. Each proved necessary for success. Bernard Lovell died in 2012, with far more public recognition for his astronomy work than for his radar contributions. His obituaries emphasized Jodrell Bank Observatory and the radio telescope bearing his name. The H2S work received less attention, perhaps because it remained classified for decades after the war. Perhaps because its association with strategic bombing made it controversial, perhaps simply because peacetime achievements are more celebrated than wartime technical development. But among historians of technology and military operations, Lovell's H2S work is recognized as a crucial achievement that changed aerial warfare. The radar system he developed enabled bombing operations that would have been impossible without it. Whether those operations were justified remains debated. That they were enabled by Lovell's work is indisputable. The story of how forbidden radar destroyed Hamburg ultimately is about the courage to challenge orthodoxy when lives depend on it. Regulations serve important purposes. Security concerns are legitimate. Chain of command exists for good reasons. But sometimes circumstances require setting aside normal procedures to address overwhelming necessity. Lovell understood that continuing to restrict H2S deployment would cost thousands of bomber crew lives while achieving minimal military results. He understood that the security risk, while real, was less catastrophic than the operational failure occurring every night over Germany. He acted on that understanding despite official prohibition. His defiance created the capability that made Operation Gomorrah possible. 42,000 people died in Hamburg because bombers could navigate accurately using radar Churchill's science advisor had forbidden. Thousands of bomber crew members survived subsequent operations because H2S improved navigation and reduced losses. Whether the trade-off was morally justified depends on one's view of strategic bombing. Whether it was militarily effective is clear. The technology worked exactly as intended. The lesson extends beyond World War II. In every conflict, military organizations face similar decisions about balancing security, innovation, and operational necessity. The right answer changes with circumstances, but the challenge remains constant. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with bureaucratic defiance. Sometimes the greatest victories come from courage to challenge orthodoxy when rules conflict with reality. H2S radar proved that innovation, even when it violates official policy, can have strategic consequences that change wars. The forbidden technology that destroyed Hamburg saved countless lives by making bombing effective. Whether it should have been used to destroy cities is a question historians will debate forever. That it worked is indisputable. That it required defiance of authority to deploy is clear. That the defiance was necessary is the lesson. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.